welcome on back to the GSMC Football Podcast. I am your host once again, Matthew Quinn. We are brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. We do have a very good show for you guys today. We'll be covering some season outlooks. We're going to stick to the NFC East, and we're going to have three different season outlooks for the NFC East, and the Giants, the Cowboys, and then the Commanders. We're going to save the Super Bowl champion Eagles for tomorrow's show. And also we've got some mock drafts that I'm going to go over as we continue that series on picks 26 through 30. And we'll be covering the last two of my mock draft in tomorrow's show as well. That's why I kind of wanted to combine the Eagles since they were one of the last two picks. And also later in the show, make sure you stick around as I'm going to also be giving you my top 5 college football teams that could surprise people. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win a national championship or anything like that. I just feel like these teams have a good chance of actually having a little bit of success next year in college football. So we'll get into that, and that's the last part of the show. But before we start, I would like to, as always, ask that you guys like and follow the show. If you got a question during the show that you want answered, just go into the super chat and type down your question or your comment, and then we'll get to it as soon as we can. And your input is a big part of what makes this show great, and we thrive on your energy and your insight. So whether it's a quick comment, a thoughtful question, or an opinion that you just have to share, don't hesitate to drop it in the chat. Now, if you do want to make absolutely sure that your message stands out and gets featured on the show, there's an easy way to do that. You can just use the super chat feature. Just click the $ at the bottom of the chat box to send in your super chat. This guarantees that your message gets on the air, and it's also a fantastic way to support our channel. We rely on your support to keep bringing you the sports content that you love, and we do appreciate every single bit of it. So just go ahead, let us know what you're thinking, hit that super chat button, and let's keep this show interactive and exciting. And if you prefer, you can also go to gsmcsports.net to tip, donate, and leave a comment or a question there. And we couldn't do what we do without you guys' amazing support. So we're always so thankful to have you as part of our community. And again, the link for that super chat is gsmcpodcast.net. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the show here. We're going to go right into our season outlook series, talking about the New York Giants so far today. If you take a look at what they did last year, obviously it wasn't necessarily the best year last year. There was a whole combination of things that went wrong. Obviously, the whole Saquon Barkley thing that was actually filmed on HBO Hard Knocks between the GM, who's saying that he really didn't want Saquon Barkley to go to the Eagles and all that stuff. And then they ended up essentially choosing Daniel Jones over Saquon Barkley, and we all, of course, know how that turned out. But last season they finished 3-14. They were dead last in the NFC East. They did cut Daniel Jones during the season, which just adds another layer to that Saquon Barkley fiasco that they had. And it's just a shame that they didn't wisen up and sign Saquon when they had the chance to, because he's doing great things elsewhere now. And now Daniel Jones is on his third team after he signed with the Indianapolis Colts in this offseason. So a big mess there for the Giants to try and pick up, and it's kind of part of the reason why Joe Schoen and to some extent Brian Daboll, the head coach, are kind of on the hot seat coming into this year. They really need to get the draft right, because if they don't and they have another disastrous season like it was last year, then it's, probably going to be it for both of those guys. They're probably not going to be retained. And it's a shame, because I do think Brian Daboll is a good head coach. He just hasn't really had a lot to work with in New York. Some bad management on the personnel side from the front office and all that has just kind of bled into, bad play on the field. So it's unfortunate, but he's probably going to get the axe if they have another year like they did last year, because they've got to see some improvement on this debacle, really, that the New York Giants are going through right now. But in terms of what they did last year, just statistically, they finished 28th in passing yards per game, 23rd in rushing, and 30th in total yards per game. So obviously the offense was not where you want it to be. There was a combination of Daniel Jones, who played about 10 games and had just over 2,000 yards with about 8 touchdowns and 7 picks. He also fumbled a couple times too, but he played 10 games, and of course Tommy DeVito and Drew Lock played a couple games as well. But it just overall just was not a very good year for the Giants. The bright spot on offense, at least, was Malik Neighbors, the rookie wide receiver that they got in the draft last year. He ended up being a really, really good receiver. He had over 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns. And just think what he could do with at least decent quarterback play on the New York Giants, depending on what they do in the draft, or if they maybe sign Russell Wilson or Aaron Rodgers or one of these guys. Maybe he gets even better numbers than he had last year, and that's saying something because he was very, very good last year. Now, as far as depth is concerned, they did re-sign Darius Slayton in the offseason, so that'll be a good, piece to keep on your roster, a veteran presence and all that. But don't be shocked if they go wide receiver at some point in the draft, if not early. Not sure, exactly what they might do, but, of course, they have the number 3 pick, so their options are pretty much wide open. Sort of feeling that they're probably going to go quarterback, though, depending on what shakes out in the draft with trades and things like that. They could go, quarterback, maybe Cam Ward if they trade up, because there has been talk that they could potentially trade up with the Titans to snag that guy. I don't know if that's going to happen so much anymore, as it's starting to become more and more clear that the Titans might just go ahead and select Cam Ward with that number 1 pick, and they may not trade it. But, of course, anything can happen between now and draft time. And then, of course, on draft night, a lot of things, trades and things of that nature usually happen on a draft night. A lot of surprising trades. So a lot of different things can happen. But defensively, they're in need of an upgrade defensively as well. They did have some positives on the defense. Dexter Lawrence, he led the team in sacks, and they were 7th in the league total in sacks. They were 8th against the pass, too, so their secondary was, pretty solid overall. Their problem really was run defense. Their run defense was not very good at all. They were 27th in the league in rush defense and in terms of yards allowed per game. So they need to get better that way. So they may go defense at some point in the draft. I wouldn't be surprised if they did, because it is, like I've said numerous times at this point, a very, very deep defensive line class in the draft. So even if they don't go defensive line with that 3rd pick, which I don't think they will, they could potentially, go somewhere like that in the later rounds, maybe 3rd round, 4th round, something like that, depending on what shakes out in the rest of the draft. But in terms of what their needs are, it's pretty obvious and apparent that, their need is a quarterback. But the situation is kind of different, because they could go with best player available sort of route, like some teams tend to do, and they could look towards next year as their year to go after their franchise guy. Maybe they sign one of those veterans that are still, kind of lurking out there, whether it be Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson or even Jameis Winston, who they had a visit with yesterday, I believe it was. So any of those options, they could go that route and then just go quarterback next year, because I don't think any of those veteran guys that are out there right now are a future quarterback for you. I mean, that's a 1-year bridge, 2-year max, depending on what guy you sign. Aaron Rodgers, I think, would just be a 1-year thing. I don't think he would last more than 1 year. Russell Wilson, probably more likely to be 2 years, but I still think it would be 1 year for him as well. And Jameis Winston, believe it or not, is actually the one guy that you could see him, being on the roster at least for more than 1 year. But the thing about Jameis Winston that scares a lot of people is how many interceptions he tends to throw. He's one of those guys that can be, have one of those games. It's like he's going to throw 400 or 500 yards and 5 touchdowns, but he'll also throw about 4 or 5 picks as well in that same game. He's just that kind of quarterback. I mean, you could say he's a gunslinger, but he tends to be a little reckless with the ball, which of course turns off a lot of head coaches. But his personality is pretty infectious. I mean, it would be fun to have Jameis on your team. He's usually a fun guy to watch at the very least, because you never know what you're going to get out of him, but you're going to get entertainment regardless. So if they go ahead and sign Jameis Winston, it'll probably be pretty cheap, and they can have him just run the team for a year and then just focus on their drafting of their franchise quarterback in next year's NFL draft, which is going to be a much better class quarterback-wise, with guys like Drew Aller and, of course, Arch Manning, guys like that. So they could be available. And wouldn't it be something if the Giants ended up with another Manning in terms of their quarterback? That would be pretty interesting to see for sure. But, a couple of other things that they did so far in this free agency, they did shore up that safety position at least a little bit with the signing of Javon Holland from Miami in free agency. They do need to upgrade the interior of that line. They did re-sign their interior guard, Greg Van Roten. He's about 35 years old now, though. He is a veteran lineman. And at this point, if you're with the Giants, you're trying to rebuild your team. You're trying to start from the ground up, essentially. You need new quarterbacks, all kinds of things. So you need an offensive line to protect whatever young quarterback you end up getting, whether that be this year or next year. If it's next year, then you definitely want to focus on upgrading that offensive line so that your next quarterback who comes in already has at least a decent offensive line and is not running for his life and developing bad rookie habits, as guys tend to do when they don't get a lot of time to throw the ball or anything like that. So they've got a lot of work to do, the Giants, but I could see them improving their roster a little bit at least, but it's all going to kind of hinge on what happens at quarterback. I don't think any of the available quarterbacks are going to take them to the playoffs or anything like that. Even if they draft a guy, say they get Cam Ward, I still don't think that he is going to lead them to the playoffs because there's just too many other things that the Giants need right now. But at the very least, you could have some positivity if you get Cam Ward and he shows some signs, of promise that he could potentially be a franchise quarterback for you. Then, of course, you got to take that as a positive. But if you're a New York Giants fan, I feel like you want to hedge all your bets on going franchise quarterback next season when it's a much better crop of quarterbacks, and maybe just get best player available with that third pick. You have plenty of players to choose from, at best player available with the number 3 pick. So, Travis Hunter could be the best player available for them. There's even been talk that Shedeur Sanders possibly at number 3. I don't know about that one. A lot of things have been said about Shedeur Sanders in a relatively negative light in this whole process of combine and scouting and, leading up to the draft and all that. Don't know if it's necessarily all fair, it's not necessarily all his fault, all of the, things that are coming out about him, but I don't think that should really affect his draft stock, but, it's not the world we live in, unfortunately. So teams look at any kind of negative thing and then they'll have them fall down on their draft board. But, Shedeur Sanders would be at least an upgrade over what they had last year, so. And they add a couple other guys receiver-wise to pair with Darius Slayton and then, of course, Malik Neighbors, then, maybe they are scrappy a little bit, and maybe they get a little bit better, running the ball and just offensively in general. Of course, they need to be better defensively and, keep Dexter Lawrence, happy with, the rest of the defense around him. He's putting up numbers, getting a ton of sacks and everything, but the defense is still terrible against the run, then that doesn't really reflect him very well as the rest of the defensive front. So he needs to be better at run stopping as well as the rest of the our defensive line. So it's a full team effort, as everything in football usually is. So as far as what I think that they might do next year in terms of record prediction, again, it's all going to be hinging on what they do in the draft or, quarterback-wise in their veteran free agencies, in terms of like Winston, Wilson, and Rodgers. If they get any of those guys or whatever, like I said before, I don't think that it's going to be much of a difference for the Giants. I do think that they could snag a couple of extra wins than they had. I don't think they have as bad a year as they had this past season. I mean, you can't really have much worse of a year unless you go completely winless, but I think that they could probably get to about 5, maybe 6 wins, depending on how things shake out with their quarterback situation. If they get Rodgers, who knows, maybe they can sneak 7 wins or something like that, depending on how committed Aaron Rodgers wants to be to that Giants team if he decides to go there. But, so that covers it for the New York Giants. So when we come back, we're going to talk about the team that everybody loves to talk about, and that's the Dallas Cowboys. We're going to do a season outlook for them and what Jerry Jones might be thinking going into this upcoming season and in the draft and all of that. So just stick with us. We will be right back right after this, and we'll talk some more season outlooks.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
All right, guys, welcome on back to the show. And before we get into the next part of our show, I just want to remind you guys that if you have any questions or comments and you want to donate or just, send a comment or anything like that, just hit the super chat button, gsmcpodcast.net or gsmcsports.net, and you can type down your question or your comment, and then we can get to it as soon as we can. So let's go ahead and get into the rest of the show. We've got the next segment coming up, and that is going to be the Dallas Cowboys, America's favorite team to talk about, at least. And they've got, obviously, always got a ton of headlines with the Dallas Cowboys. What they might do, coming into this year, whether or not they're all in or not, depending on what Jerry Jones might be thinking. But taking a look at what they did last season, they were 7-10. They had a number of negative things happen to them last season, though. Dak Prescott, he ended up getting hurt and missed a lot of games, and they were just inconsistent from even when Dak was playing. I mean, Dak was putting up decent numbers, but, the team overall was still underachieving, as a lot of people didn't really expect. I mean, typically with the Cowboys, you kind of expect them to have a good regular season, and then once they get into the playoffs, that's when all of the negative headlines start to rear their ugly heads, and people start, really having fun at the expense of the Dallas Cowboys, whenever they struggle in the playoffs. But, that's kind of what comes with being one of the most popular teams, not just in the NFL, but in the world in terms of fan bases. So, I mean, that's just the way that it comes. It comes with the territory, unfortunately. A lot of the big teams tend to go through that. But taking a look at their stats, what they had last year, they finished 11th overall in passing yards. So the combination of Dak, who played in just a few games, and Cooper Rush played in about 12 games. Dak had just under 2,000 yards passing and 11 touchdowns. Also had 8 interceptions, so obviously you want to see him cut down that ratio. And Cooper Rush, he played in about 12 games, and he had 1,800 yards passing, 12 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions. So a better ratio from Cooper Rush. And they actually started to play a little bit better towards the end of the year with Cooper Rush, but obviously still not where you want to be. I mean, there was a time where it was looking like the Cowboys were only going to get about maybe 3 or 4 wins the way they were going. But they ended up stringing some wins together towards the end of the year and finished with a relatively, respectable 7-10 record. I mean, all things considered, it was a respectable record, considering everything that they had to deal with throughout the course of the season with Dak getting hurt and all of that. But, overall, their offense still needs to be better. We'll see if they end up doing that. They were 27th in passing yards, rushing yards, not passing yards, 27th in rushing yards. So obviously you want to be better on that, ground as well as far as your offense. You don't want to be one-dimensional as an offense, because then that's how you end up getting middle of the pack to bottom of the league in the NFL. And, lo and behold, the Cowboys offense was about middle of the pack. They were 17th in total yards. And as I said before his injury, Dak had just under 2,000 yards. So, you want to see an improvement. Obviously, you want Dak to stay healthy, and he's had a couple of injuries here over in the last couple years, and it hurts even more for if you're a Cowboys fan, because Dak gets hurt right after he signs that big deal in the offseason. And, questions remain with Dak is, if he can be the guy that can ultimately lead them to a Super Bowl championship, which is what, every team strives to accomplish. So whether or not he can lead them, it still remains to be seen. He hasn't really shown enough, or at least, the rest of the team as a whole. It just doesn't seem like they ever really have everything working together, because even not last year, but the year before that, Dak had tremendous numbers, but the Cowboys still fizzled out in the playoffs to Green Bay, who had an up-and-coming quarterback of their own, who just basically wiped the floor with them in Dallas. And then, of course, Dak gets hurt this year, and then it just is a disastrous year to start. And they, find a little bit of momentum towards the end of the year. But, of course, it was just too late. They got themselves in too big of a hole. But, yeah, so it was an up and down, to say the least, sort of year for the Cowboys. Rico Dowdle, their running back, he's no longer there. He ended up going to the Carolina Panthers in free agency. They did sign Javonte Williams from Denver. I still think that they're probably going to go running back at some point in the draft, because I don't think Javonte Williams is a guy that's going to be your franchise running back that can get you those crazy numbers, or, like not necessarily like Saquon, because those are crazy numbers, but like maybe a 1,200-yard season, something like that. I don't know if he has, that in him, at least with the team that's going to be around him anyway, because he didn't have necessarily the greatest year in Denver last year. That offense struggled a little bit to begin, and they found their groove as the season went on, of course, but that was mainly because of Bo Nix being able to work with his receivers. But he's coming over now to Dallas, and they desperately need a running game. Ever since those first couple of years with Ezekiel Elliott, when he was the leader in rushing yards, they haven't really had a guy that they can really depend on to be like your big-time running back, your home run hitter. Of course, they had Tony Pollard for a while there after Ezekiel Elliott left and bounced around a couple other teams. Elliott was on the team last year too, but obviously not nearly as effective as he was when he was first drafted there out of Ohio State. But, Dowdle leaving is, a loss, but, I think it's kind of like one of those lateral moves. When you lose Dowdle and then you get Javonte Williams, I don't think there's much of an improvement there at the running back position. And luckily for the Cowboys, there's a very good crop of running backs coming to the NFL draft in just a few weeks, and maybe they snag one on one of those days. They don't necessarily have to do it in the first round, because it's one of those drafts that you can get a valuable guy and possibly a starter or future starter in day 2, day 3, because it's a deep draft. There's a lot of guys out there that they could get. Even if they go running back first round, I mean, that's obviously, it's going to depend on how everything shakes out. Ashton Genty, of course, is the number 1 rated running back. Then you've got a guy like Amarian Hampton, who's out there too. He's been mocked to a bunch of different teams. Should the Cowboys have an opportunity to draft either one of those guys, I feel like they should do it, and they'd be fools not to, because that is the one thing that they are missing on offense in terms of, just running the ball. They need a big-time running back, because that's when the Cowboys were really, really good. At least in the regular season, they have their own fits in the playoffs that they'll need to sort out if and when they ever get back there. But, running the ball, that was one of the key things that they were really, really good at, because they had a very, very good offensive line. That strong running game is built very similar to what the Eagles have going now, but the only difference between that team and the Eagles team is the Cowboys team didn't have the defense that the Eagles had last year and still do have. But yeah, that's what they need. You got to start in the trenches. If anything has been learned over this past season, it's that building through the trenches and having a quality running back matters in this league as much as it matters having a franchise quarterback. You got to have a solid, running game as well to back that up, because like I said before, you don't want to be one-dimensional, because that's how teams can capitalize on what you're doing and just shut you completely down if they only have to worry about one part of your offense and you're not very good at the other, whether it's rushing or passing. They can just focus on what you're good at and take away any opportunity for you to make plays, because you're not good at whatever it is, that you're lacking on offense, whether that's rushing or passing. So, a lot of things that the Cowboys, have questions. One of the main questions that they have starts at the top, and that is head coach Brian Schottenheimer, which is a kind of, meh sort of hiring for the Dallas Cowboys. They let go of Mike McCarthy, and in my opinion, I feel like they might as well have just kept Mike McCarthy at least one more season, because Brian Schottenheimer, in my opinion, is just a name place, just a guy to take up a spot in the company employment book, because really the head coach, as we all know, is Jerry Jones. Whatever he says goes. If he wants a guy starting, he's going to be starting, and Brian Schottenheimer is not going to be the guy that's going to tell him no. Whenever the Cowboys were really good, honestly, it was with head coaches that, combated a lot of what Jerry Jones said. Jimmy Johnson clashed with Jerry Jones a lot, and, he won a Super Bowl there. But then Jimmy Johnson ends up leaving because of differences with Jerry Jones back in the day. Then they, end up getting his replacement, and then basically Barry Switzer wins a Super Bowl with Jimmy Johnson's team. And, then you look back at when they had Bill Parcells. They were decent, making the playoffs consistently and things like that. They still had their own issues winning playoff games, of course, but, Bill Parcells is one of those guys who's not a yes man. But Jerry Jones just hired Brian Schottenheimer, who was a former coordinator with them a year ago, just hired him, and knowing that he's going to essentially be a yes man, and he's not going to ruffle any feathers or anything like that. But that's kind of what you need, though, in a head coach, especially for the Cowboys. You need a guy that's going to, talk back, or not disrespectfully or anything like that, but challenge, Jerry Jones's decisions, because that could lead to some, animosity and some hostility, of course, but it could also lead to some positive results on the field as well. But, that's a whole other conversation for another day. But in terms of what they need, like I said before, they could draft a receiver possibly, but, and corner, I think, is probably most likely where they would probably go, because with Trayvon Diggs expected to miss part of the season, you would think that they probably want to bring in another young guy and just kind of try and offset what Trayvon Diggs brings. Jalen Tolbert at wide receiver, he's their second wide receiver right now, and they did re-sign Kavontae Turpin, but he's been more of like a return man / third, fourth receiver for them. And CeeDee Lamb obviously is one of the best receivers in the league, so I feel like they need another guy to pair that's going to be a threat down the field, not just CeeDee Lamb, to take a little bit of pressure off of CeeDee, who can still make plays regardless of who they get, or if they don't get anybody. He can still make plays, but I feel like that offense would succeed a lot more if they had another surefire receiver in there, because I don't believe Jalen Tolbert is a wide receiver too in this league, but he could prove me wrong. He could have a monster year this coming year, who knows. But, there's a lot of questions for the Cowboys, but defensive tackle, I think they could address as well in the draft, probably in the later rounds. Just because they have more pressing needs to potentially get with that first pick. So I think defensive tackle, since it's a pretty deep class in that regard, they could probably go day 2 possibly for that, maybe second or third round, and get a defensive tackle who's still pretty quality. But overall, my prediction for them in terms of their record, I think they go 9-8 if they stay healthy. I think there's enough talent on the offensive side of the ball. If Dak can stay healthy and they have a new offensive system and all that, and maybe they try and push some of the drama from last year away, and I don't know if they're going to be playoff bound, just because that division has suddenly gotten a lot tougher, with both the Eagles and the Commanders making huge strides last year, and of course the Eagles winning the Super Bowl, but the Commanders of course making huge strides and being way better than a lot of people thought. So it's going to be tough for the Cowboys, and I don't think they get in. I think it's just they'll sneak into a wild card, if that, but I think they're going to be on the outside looking in at the end of the day. 9-8 if they stay healthy. I think that's best case scenario for the Cowboys. But moving on, before we get into our next segment, we're going to finish out our season outlook portion of this show. We're going to talk about the Washington Commanders. Obviously, a lot of positivity is going around in Washington right now in terms of their football team. So, we'll get into some of the things that they did last year, as well as some of the things they still need to do if they want to get over that hump and get past the NFC Championship game to the Super Bowl. So just stick with us, and we will be right back right after this break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
All right, guys, welcome on back to the show. We're going to get into our final season outlook of this episode. We're going to be talking about the upstart Washington Commanders, and obviously a lot of things happened with them last year. Not a lot of people expected the Commanders to be where they were, myself included. I didn't expect them to get to 12 wins. I honestly didn't even have them getting to 10 wins, but they exceeded myself and a lot of other people's expectations with a tremendous draft pickup with Jaden Daniels, obviously winning Rookie of the Year last year, and rightfully so. He was outstanding for a good chunk of the year. Started a little slow, had a couple of games, especially that game against the Bucs, the first game. He did not look great. Didn't look like the Jaden Daniels that we ended up seeing. But, of course, his first game as a starter, you can forgive that. And they were 12-5 last year, second place in the NFC East. And, of course, they lost in the NFC Championship game to the Eagles. But more surprising about that whole thing is that the number one seed in the NFC last year was the Detroit Lions. And they went into Detroit and handled the Lions pretty well, pretty easily for the most part. I mean, the Lions made it look a little bit more respectable towards the end of the game, but the Commanders were dominating that game. Their offense was just doing whatever it wanted because that Lions defense, not only was it just shredded with injuries, but they didn't really have any answers to Jaden Daniels and his weapons. And that Cliff Kingsbury-led offense, the offensive coordinator, they were great. They had a lot of games like that last year. It wasn't just in the playoffs. It was, right after like the second or third game, you started to really see what Jaden Daniels could do. And, his numbers speak for themselves. I mean, he had 3,500 yards passing, 25 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. He also added 6 touchdowns on the ground, and he was their leading rusher as well as, of course, their leading passer, but he was their leading rusher, had almost 1,000 yards, and so those numbers, that's about 3,500 yards, damn near 1,000 yards rushing as well. And then, of course, the 6 touchdowns rushing. So he ended up having 31 touchdowns total with just the 9 interceptions. So he was fantastic. Rookie of the Year, absolutely. And even in the playoffs, it didn't really look like it was a big situation for him, that the game was too big for him. He always was very, very calm and collected, very poised in the pocket, and very poised just overall in big moments. You could absolutely see what the Commanders really liked in him when they ended up drafting him. And I remember when they drafted him, the two quarterbacks in last year's draft, it was Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, who was the better quarterback, who's the better prospect. I sort of always lean towards Jaden Daniels, and that's mainly because I'm a Gators fan. So in the SEC, watching him play against the Gators and watching him in the SEC anyway, I knew how good he was. Not to say that Caleb Williams wasn't, but, let's be completely serious here. The SEC, at least last year anyway, or the year that Jaden was, still with LSU, was a stronger conference than the Pac-12 was at that time. And, USC, it's a big school, and obviously Caleb Williams, was good, and he has his own things that he needs to improve on. But I think the Commanders won that out of the Bears Commanders, who won, who's the better quarterback. I think Jaden Daniels proved it, at least in his rookie season, and who knows, Caleb Williams could end up going on to having a better career than Jaden Daniels, but we don't know that. But Jaden Daniels had the better rookie season, of course, and he makes the Commanders look very, very smart by going ahead and picking him up. And offensively, taking a look at just their stats, their numbers, 5th in the league in points per game with 28. and they were 7th in total yards per game with just under 370, 3rd in the league in rushing, and 17th in passing yards per game. So obviously you want to see the passing yards kind of uptick a little bit, because Jaden Daniels, he's a very good runner of the football, and he also is a very good thrower of the football. But you want to see a little bit more production out of the passing game, but still not terrible numbers overall. I mean, that's about middle of the pack, and if you have a top 5, top 10 offense overall anyway, you can forgive a couple of the setbacks that you might get here and there. Brian Robinson is their running back right now. He's a solid running back. Obviously, they picked up Austin Eckler in last year's offseason, but he was kind of a mixed sort of player. I mean, he had about 400 yards rushing, and he had about 400 yards receiving. So he did a little bit of everything. It wasn't just running the ball. So he was effective in a sense, but Brian Robinson is their number one back, and maybe they go get somebody as a depth piece with just the quality of running backs that they have in this draft. You feel like you kind of owe it to your franchise to at least take a shot on one of these guys, maybe in the later rounds if there's a guy that you like. So wouldn't be surprised if they went somewhere in that direction in the later rounds of the draft. The addition of Deebo Samuel, I think, is very good for this offense. I mean, he may not be the guy that he once was when he was in San Francisco, but I know his numbers have declined over the past several years or past couple years. I mean, that's a combination of just the whole offense as a whole struggling because of injuries, and then, of course, Deebo had a couple of injuries himself, and I think a lot of other factors just kind of factored into him not playing particularly well. And, if you compare it to his previous years where he's, in Super Bowls and in NFC Championship games, putting up crazy numbers and all that. But I think a whole new, fresh start for Deebo Samuel will be a very, very good thing for him, and I think he's going to be motivated. And, of course, he's got one of the best receivers in the league to take some of the pressure off of him, and you got Terry McLaurin. He's going to draw most of the attention, but Deebo Samuel on the field will draw some of that attention, and that'll give Terry McLaurin extra opportunities as well. And Deebo, who also is a very good route runner, he can get open underneath and things like that. So I think that'll be a good tandem for them. So good offense there. Obviously, you want to see improvement every single year, but, that's pretty good for a rookie head coach, or in terms of his first year. He's not a rookie head coach, but he's first year in Washington. But the rookie quarterback, a lot of young players. Their biggest thing that they need to do this offseason is take care of that defense. The defense was one of the worst in the league in terms of stopping the run. They were 30th in the league. They gave up a lot of yards on the ground. They need to shore up that defensive front. Their secondary was decent, though. They were pretty solid, ranking 3rd in the league in passing yards allowed per game. So, some good things there. You had the Mike Sanistro, that acquisition, of course. He ended up being a lot better than some people might have thought. He ended up being a pretty solid secondary player for them, especially in the playoffs and all that. But their biggest needs, they need an edge rusher. That's really the biggest need on defense. They need somebody that can push the pocket and, get to the quarterback and allow that talented young secondary to make plays on the back end. There's plenty to choose from in terms of edge rusher in the draft. They can go a number of different directions depending on who's available. I doubt that anybody like an Abdul Carter or maybe Jalen Walker possibly is available then, but Jack Sawyer as well from Ohio State. Any of those guys, but I don't think Abdul Carter. I think Abdul Carter goes very, very early. But any of those other two guys I think would be a decent addition to that defense. I could also see a late round running back, like I said, Robinson being a solid running back and Austin Eckler, being the other running back there. I could see them going running back with the later rounds. So we'll see what they do there. But, they lost De'Ami Brown, their wide receiver in free agency. They lost him to Jacksonville. So you feel like they're probably going to add another depth piece there as well, whether a lot of their needs in the offseason. So, we'll see if they decide to, go anywhere else with the wide receiver. I think they will probably have the same record that they had last year. I don't think that it's going to be a super huge improvement in terms of record-wise. I think it's 12-5, but I still think that they could end up being a better team overall. It's just, that's a tough division, that you have to go through the Philadelphia Eagles twice. So those are two tough games right off the bat. And depending on what the rest of the division looks like, because typically with the NFC East, it's a different division winner every single year. So it was the Eagles last year, and we'll see if the Commanders can overtake the Eagles. Maybe the Eagles have a Super Bowl hangover since they lost several pieces on defense, and maybe the Commanders can sneak in and become the division winner. And maybe they can go further than that. Who knows? I mean, they got to the NFC Championship game last year when Jaden Daniels was a rookie. So it's very possible, with that offense, if they can play the way they did last year, especially towards the end of the year, and that defense gets a little better and they're able to rush the passer a lot better than they were and stop the run a lot better than they were, then maybe they could get over the hump and get past teams like the Lions or the Eagles or, whatever the Vikings end up being with J.J. McCarthy. So it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be fun to watch because that is the one thing about this Commanders team is that they were fun to watch last year because of that offense and how, dynamic it was. Another key piece, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, was, of course, them re-signing Zach Ertz. I think that is a sneaky good re-signing because he is a solid, reliable tight end, and every good quarterback needs to have that safety blanket. And that safety blanket is a good thing to have with Zach Ertz. He's got that experience, and obviously he's been in the system for a year already. So I think that's a good decision with them going ahead and re-signing him. Signing Bobby Wagner, I think, is a sneaky good move too, the re-signing of him, because he was a lot better than a lot of people might have thought he was going to be last year because, of course, he's a Hall of Famer, no doubt. But he's getting up there in age as well. So you don't know how good or how long you're going to have quality play from him. But he was at least solid last year, bringing them over, of course, from Seattle. But a good job getting him locked up, too, for another year. I think it wouldn't be surprised if this is his last year because he's been in the league for a while and accomplished a lot of things. He's got a Super Bowl and all of that. So, we'll see what he does at the end of next season. But still a solid addition or re-addition to that defense. But so that's what I have for the Commanders. I got 12-5, possibly an NFC East title. That's kind of where I'm at with the Commanders right now. So we'll see if that ends up being true. Only time will tell. But before we go ahead and get into the rest of our show, we're just going to take another break, and we're going to talk about some of the mock draft picks that I have set up in our ongoing series. This one is going to be picks 26 through 30. And if you're wondering why I don't have picks 31 and 32 on this, that's because next show tomorrow I'm going to be doing the mock draft and, the season outlook for the Philadelphia Eagles all in one segment. So I figured I would do that since the last two are the two Super Bowl participants. I feel like I'd give them a segment of their own and talk about each of those teams and what they might do in the draft, in terms of players and things like that. So we'll go ahead and we'll take another quick break, and we'll be right back right after this. Guys, welcome back to the next segment of our show. We're going to be getting into our ongoing series when we're going to be talking about my mock draft. These are picks 26 through 30. Obviously, we've done picks 1 through 25 at this point, tackled those in previous episodes, so definitely check those out if you missed those. But let's dive right on in to my first pick here, and I don't mean to spoil the pick there for you, but you know what that is. If you can remember it, that'll be nice. But I've got the Los Angeles Rams. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the camera fixed here, but got the Los Angeles Rams at pick number 26. I've got them going offensive tackle from Missouri, Armand Membu. And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that name, but I think I got it right. But obviously, the Rams need some help on the offensive line, and Membu is a good prospect for them to go ahead and look at. I've got him, going 26 to them. Take a look at what he has done and just what his attributes are just overall. I mean, he's one of those offensive tackles that has really, really good body control, and he's got poise, especially in pass protection sets. He does a very, very good job not getting out of position and, over pursuing. He can stay into the pocket and stay on assignment. He's very good at that. He keeps his weight inside too, which is, very important for a tackle like that. You don't want to get beat inside, and that's a quick, easy hit at the quarterback if you do that. So you want to be sure that you have an attribute like that if you're going to be a starting NFL offensive tackle. So he's got very, very good hands. He's pretty fluid with his footwork and his handwork. Very athletic, very agile, which is very good, especially in today's NFL with a lot of, different offensive schemes and things or defensive schemes and edge rushers who have a bunch of different other abilities than they did, say, back in the day. These guys are wide receivers or tight ends that, can rush the quarterback. That's essentially how athletic a lot of these guys in the NFL are. So you want to be athletic yourself as an offensive tackle to, be able to offset some of those speed rushers to the outside or guys who've got those quick moves to the inside that can get inside an offensive tackle and get to the quarterback. So you want to have an athletic guy, and Membu absolutely fits that. He's a big bodied guy, so he's very, very good offensive tackle and was very good for Missouri last year and the whole time that he was there, of course. But he plays with an edge too, which I really like when watching his film. He's aggressive. He finishes his blocks. He's one of those guys that's feisty. You want a tough guy like that on your offensive line, and in a pretty tough division like the NFC West, the way it typically is in the NFC West anyway, when the entire division isn't hurt. That is. So obviously you want to have a guy who can really come in there. And with the Rams, getting with Andrew Whitworth retiring several like 3-4 years ago or whatever, they're obviously trying to get that next, tackle, that next guy to lock down that position for the foreseeable future. So that would be a good guy to go along. It would go a long way for the Rams to go ahead and get a guy like that. So he may not be like the tallest tackle out there, but he's still a very, very athletic guy. So yeah, I think it would be a quality pick if they ended up picking him. So that is the Rams. The next pick that I have on the board here is going to be the Baltimore Ravens, and I've got them going Nick Amenwari out of South Carolina, the safety, the very, very athletic, very good safety, and I feel like he just has AFC North football written all over him when you watch the way he plays. Of course, the Ravens have a good safety already in Kyle Hamilton, but they do need some help at the other safety position, which I think Amenwari would do a very good job fulfilling that role. He's one of the top safety prospects in this draft. He was one of the top ranked prospects at the combine in terms of like who tested the best. He was one of the best, if not the best, safety that tested in the combine a couple weeks ago. So he tested better than anyone at his position, like I said, So taking a look at some of his stats last year, he was first team All-American, first team All-SEC as well. He did lead the team with 88 tackles. He started all 13 games, so he's got that durability, that reliability, didn't get any injuries, didn't pick up anything like that. So, you got a healthy safety in there with not any major injuries to his history. So he didn't play in the second half of their bowl loss to Illinois, but, that's typically the case in games like this, with athletes that are declaring for the draft. They kind of want to protect themselves and not play in what they might see as a meaningless bowl game. So I feel like he's got that great size and speed, that that ferocity that he could play with, that would really be a nice fit to the AFC North and how physical the teams in the AFC North tend to play. So I feel like he would just be a perfect, when I think of him, especially thinking of him on the Ravens, I feel like this is the type of guy that was made for those Ravens Steelers rivalries. Those physical games, those hard hitting games. I feel like he's made for that. I feel like he would just fit right in perfectly with the Ravens and their secondary, especially with their defense increasing or improving rather as the season went on once they added Dean Pease back to the staff. And I believe he will be back as well. So that obviously is a good thing. And Worry would have a great teacher, of course, and a lot of guys to look up to with guys like Kyle Hamilton and Marlon Humphrey on that defense. So a lot of good, talented players on that Ravens defense, as there usually is. And this would not surprise me at all if they ended up picking this guy, because this is just the type of stuff that the Ravens tend to do, and it's why they're always so consistently, good and consistently in the hunt or, contending for a Super Bowl. It's because they make the right decisions in the draft, and I feel like this would absolutely be a right decision. I mean, maybe you could make an argument they could go a different way, maybe a different player, but I feel like this guy just fits that blend of AFC North safeties, and I think it would just be a perfect fit, and it's hard to pass up a guy like that if you're a Baltimore Ravens fan. But yeah, so that's what I have the Ravens going. If we take a look at what the next pick in the lineup is here, we've got the Detroit Lions. We've got edge rusher Jalen Walker out of Georgia. That's who I have them going. And obviously we've talked about Obviously, we've talked about the Lions several times, over the course of these shows, and in some of our season outlooks, we talked about the Lions. But Jalen Walker, I think, would be a good pickup for them. Taking a look at what the Lions have faced in terms of adversity over the past few years, it's been injuries, especially on that defensive line. And Aiden Hutchinson obviously had that big time injury last year, kept him out of the whole season. He wasn't the only one who ended up getting hurt. That a lot of players on that defense ended up getting hurt, and Jalen Walker doesn't have any major injury history or anything like that, and he is a great player all around anyway. And I feel like he would fit right alongside with Aiden Hutchinson on the other side of that line. They need that edge rusher in Detroit, because that's been the one sort of thing that they've been missing. Not necessarily edge rusher, but just defense in general is kind of been their Achilles heel, and it was kind of the reason why they lost in the championship game to the Commanders last year. Their defense wasn't able to make enough plays, and you could argue that's because of their injuries that they had. They had a ton of injuries, but just even before those injuries were happening, they were still giving up a ton of points. So that is a problem, and you need one of the things that could help you give up less points is getting more and more pressure on the quarterback, and Jalen Walker would help you do that. He had the team lead, or at least he was tied for the team lead, with 6.5 sacks last year. Played in all 14 games, too. He had 60 tackles total, and also had 2 pass breakups, and he had 10.5 tackles for loss. He did also win the Butkus Award, which is the award for the nation's top linebacker. So he was fantastic last year and the entire time he was in college, with Georgia. He's one of those hybrid guys. He can take snaps as an off-ball linebacker, and he can take snaps on the edge. So that is another thing that's going to really help the Lions if they decide to choose Jalen Walker, is you can move him around. He's not one of these guys that just sits on one side. You can bounce him around the line and confuse different offenses, and that's how he could potentially, get into the quarterback or even free up some guys like Aiden Hutchinson, on that line. So he's got good enough length too. So he's really good at just breaking through blocks and powering through, whether he just uses a punch or just a swim move or something like that. He's very, very good at that. So he's very, very much a natural at that position. Highly athletic. He's very good against the run as well, which is a big thing, because that is one thing that the Lions need to improve upon as well, is their rush defense. So I could see them absolutely going Jalen Walker, and I think that would be a very good pick if he's still available on pick 28, because that's the other thing, is are these guys going to be available? But, according to my mock draft, he will be available, and that's who I have them going. So moving on to the team that we just talked about in the last segment, and that is the Washington Commanders, and I have them going edge rusher as well, but this time I have them going Ohio State, and I've got them going Jack Sawyer. I know I briefly mentioned him in the last segment when we were talking about potential guys that they could get to be the edge rusher for them, or a young edge rusher. No better guy for the Commanders right now, if especially, if he's the guy that's available. If all the big time guys like, Abdul Carter, are all gone, then Jack Sawyer he's still a first round talent. They need a good edge rusher in Washington who's also good at defending the run, and Jack Sawyer is one of those guys, because Washington, they were 30th in the league in terms of being ranked against the run last year. So they need to improve that run defense. So Jack Sawyer, not only is he good at pressuring the quarterback and getting to the quarterback, he can also stuff the run. So he's very good at that. 4.5 sacks, 6 pass breakups during Ohio State's 4-game playoff run to that title that they won last year. So that's 4 games right there. So 4.5 sacks, 6 pass breakups. Those are pretty solid numbers, in a playoff run. Obviously maybe you want a little bit more sacks, but he's produced. He's very productive. He's very, very good. He sets a very good edge, very strong edge. He can release back into that B gap, back into that tackle B gap, just like what I was talking about with the previous pick, Membu on offensive tackle. And you can get that guy right on the inside. He can beat the tackles to the inside like that. And he's fast. He's got that speed. He's got the strength. And he could be a very, very disruptive player if they use him in the right way. I think he would be a very good addition to that defense, especially with that defense needing some help at edge rusher. So I think that's a solid pick for the Commanders. And going on to our final pick of this segment, we're going to talk about the Buffalo Bills here. And you might have seen that when we first flipped over to this segment, so sorry if I spoiled it for you. But I've got them going Matthew Golden out of Texas. I feel like this is a prototypical Buffalo Bills receiver right here. He's a guy that can play in the slot. He can play outside. He's fast. He was the fastest receiver, at the combine this year. He ran a 4.29 40-yard dash, just a few milliseconds shy of Xavier Worthy's record. It's almost pretty close to Maxwell Hairston, who ran the fastest 40 in this year's 40-yard dash, this year's combine. So he was the fastest receiver, and he was one of the better receivers that are out there in terms of prospects. And the Bills, they currently have Khalil Shakir and Keon Coleman, who are solid options for sure, but Golden is one of the best prospects out there, and I feel like he would fit perfectly well into that system, especially with Josh Allen. And he led the team last year at Texas with 987 receiving yards. He had 9 receiving touchdowns, and he started all 16 games too. And he actually threw a couple passes too. And he was very good on kick returns too. He had a couple of kick returns, and he had a pretty solid average as well. And he is very good in those big play moments, making some big plays in those big games, like the SEC title game last year against Georgia. He's making big plays, He's got agile feet. He's very, very good as a route runner, and that is the perfect kind of guy for a Josh Allen-led offense. I feel like that would just fit in very, very well, that kind of, receiver, because obviously Josh Allen wants to make the big plays too, but you need a quality guy who's able to run in the slot and run it underneath on those underneath routes and make big plays and those contested catches, and I think he's very good at doing that. So he shows that ability to be able to make those big catches. And, he's very, very good, like I said, as a route runner. So obviously you want to have a guy like that on your squad and, build him up. And who better to learn, as a receiver and grow as a receiver than to have the MVP as your quarterback in Josh Allen. So be a good situation for everybody, I think, if they ended up going that route. But, yeah, so that's what I have for my mock draft on all the way up till picks 30. Like I said, we're going to do picks 31 and 32 tomorrow in our show, because I just figured I might as well just combine the Eagles and their season outlook and their mock draft all in one. And of course, we'll briefly touch on the Kansas City Chiefs because they are pick number 31 as well. So that covers it for the mock draft for tonight anyway. And when we come back, we've got one more break to take. And when we come back, when we come back, we will go ahead and we'll talk about the final segment of our show, and that's going to be the top 5 teams that I think could possibly surprise some people in college football. So stick with us, and now we're going to take a break. guys, welcome on back to the show. This is our last segment of the show, and we're going to be switching some gears here a little bit. We're going to be moving into some college football talk. I know we talk a lot of NFL here, but obviously college football is starting spring training on a lot of campuses over the country here, so figure we might as well, with the college basketball March Madness going on, I felt like now's a good time to kind of dip into some college football, just to kind of talk all things college, So top 5 college football teams I think could surprise some people. Now, I think I should say, because I got a little bit of pushback in the production meeting about some of my picks here, but I just want to reiterate, like I did in the production meeting, that this list that I have here is not a list that is teams that I think could challenge for a national championship or even make the playoffs for that matter. Some of these teams may make the playoffs, but overall, this is just teams that I think could surprise some people in terms of like maybe they are a little bit more successful than what people might think they might be. So, very low standards I'm going with here. I'm not going for the glory just yet. That'll come once the college football season gets closer and closer to kicking off. We'll look more into teams that I think could win the national championship. But as of right now, this is just teams that I think could surprise. And also, I should also say that I don't have North Carolina on this list anymore, but I did before. In the production meeting, I got a little bit of pushback saying that Texas Tech wasn't on the list, and the more and more I researched it, the more I was, found to be incorrect on leaving Texas Tech off. So Texas Tech is on this list, of course, but just a little special shout out to North Carolina because, of course, they have Bill Belichick. So I feel like, if anything, it'll be interesting to watch them as the season goes along to see if he can translate his monumental success that he had in the NFL, if he can translate that to college football. So that'll be fun to watch. But starting off with the first team, and this is in no particular order, the first team that I have on the list is the team that I just touched on a second ago, and that is Texas Tech. Take a look at what they did last year. They finished 8-4 last year, 6-3 in Big 12 play. They did have one of the nation's top recruiting classes this year, so I think that'll absolutely improve where they stand. They could end up having, they're one of these teams that could sneak into the playoffs potentially in the Big 12. They have a returning quarterback, Baron Morton. He did have that offseason shoulder surgery, so that is admittedly a little bit of a question. And the other question that they have really is that they have to replace their standout running back, Taj Brooks, who, of course, is no longer on the team. So they'll have to improve that, but, they do. He was the all-time career leading rusher in Texas Tech history. So obviously that's hard to replace a guy like that. But, they could potentially, do that. They head coach Joey McGuire, he added 17 players in the transfer portal, not to mention, players just from recruiting and things like that. But in the transfer portal, he added a lot of guys there and a lot of former 4-star recruits in that transfer portal too. So that will, of course, make them more and more interesting to watch, and definitely keep a close eye on Texas Tech as they could sneak into the college football playoff, especially with the 12-team expansion, that they started last year. So wouldn't be surprised if Texas Tech snuck in there. They could end up having a pretty good year. So we'll see if they, back up what I'm saying here. So moving on to the SEC, we've got LSU. I like what they've done. I like what they did last year towards the end of the year, and I like the fact that they're returning their quarterback, Garrett Nussmeier, and they do have a relatively favorable schedule, as favorable as you can, say in the SEC. But the reason I say that is because there are 3 playoff teams from the SEC that they do not have to play this year, and that is Georgia, Tennessee, and Texas. All 3 very, very good teams from a year ago, so they get a little bit of the benefit of the doubt by not playing those guys. They're still a good team anyway, so, that's the thing that could have maybe stopped them from making the playoffs, is having to run a gauntlet like those 3 teams. They don't have to do that this year. They still have several teams, that are going to be tough. They could potentially get to like a 3-0 record before they have to take on Florida, who I think is another up-and-coming team that I'll touch on here in a little bit. But they could potentially see themselves going to a 3-0, maybe 4-0 start if they're able to knock off Florida. So, we'll see what happens with them. I mean, they do have the number one ranked transfer portal overall in the nation. So they had 2 new coordinators last year, and I think that is another thing that you have to take into account. They had 2 new coordinators on both offense and defense, so now there's more continuity there. So second-year guys, they more adapt to what they want to run and what they want to call. So I feel like there'll be a little bit more comfortability there in LSU. Defense should be better due to all those transfer additions. Number one transfer portal, you better get some quality players if you're getting ranked that. So I think that they definitely will have that. They do start the season at Clemson, which will be tough to play in Death Valley there. And they also, another thing to think about, they haven't won a season opener since 2019. So this is going on 6 years if they're unable to do it this year at Clemson. But I think they have a good enough team to where they can absolutely do that. And, we'll see, if they can break that streak of season opening losses as we start the college football season in just a few months. But moving on to the next team on my list, I have Michigan. And Michigan, of course, head coach Sharon Moore is going into his second year. They didn't have a whole lot to shout about last year, but they did end the season pretty strong. They beat both Ohio State and Alabama towards the end of the year. And Ohio State, obviously, we know, ended up going on to win the national championship. But, Ohio State, they've done a pretty good job against Ohio State in recent years, dating back to when they still had Jim Harbaugh and all that. But Sharon Moore was the head coach this year, and a lot of people just assumed that Ohio State was just going to wipe the floor with them because of how good Ohio State was last year. But Michigan pulled the upset. It was a very low-scoring game. They played the way they wanted to play, and they were physical, and they did a very good job. And they did a similar thing to Alabama when they played them later on. The only thing with Michigan is they did lose several key players to the NFL draft: Mason Graham, Colston Loveland, both the defensive lineman and tight end, respectively. So they lost a couple other guys, too. So they'll have to adjust to that. But they did have some additions via recruiting and the transfer portal, and I think that'll help overall just help improve the team. Their defensive coordinator, Wink Martindale, does return. They struggled a little bit at the beginning of the year, but at the end of the year, with his 3 back-to-back strong performances, both against Indiana, who were a threat last year, Ohio State, who won the national championship, and Alabama, who, of course, are Alabama, and they're always a tough team to play. So those 3 strong performances, maybe they can translate that into next year and carry the momentum into this next year and be one of those teams that, could potentially sneak into the playoffs. You never know. But the Big Ten is a very, very hard conference, one of the best, if not the best now. It was the SEC for a while, but the Big Ten, I think you can make the argument that they're the best conference now. But, so we'll see what Michigan can do. It's going to be tough for them. They've got a tough schedule, but they could still make some noise, I think, overall. But moving on, the next team that I have, we got 2 more teams left on this. So the next team I have is South Carolina. And South Carolina, they're coming off a very strong season in which they won 9 games, and they were in the top 25 most of the year. I think the early projections that they had, early rankings that I've seen, they had them ranked at like 22, I believe. But you take a look at their quarterback, Lenoris Sellers. He's a dual threat guy. He's an electric quarterback. He's coming back. And another thing is tight end Michael Smith. I feel like he's going to be a matchup nightmare for teams. Just look at his size overall. He's 6'6", 250-pound tight end. He didn't have, many catches or anything like that last year, but that's because they already had a solid tight end already. And of course, he is no longer on the team. So Michael Smith will be the guy, the tight end 1, on this roster. And I think he could absolutely be a nightmare for defenses at his size. If he can just, shore up his ball catching abilities and some route running and things like that, I think he could end up being a very, very good player. He was a freshman last year, so going into his second year, he's got a lot more responsibility. So we'll see if he can end up, being that big tight end that they want. Defensively, that is where their strength lies. They have Dylan Stewart. He's a beast of a pass rusher. Last year, of course, they had Kyle Kennard, who was the SEC Player of the Year. He paired with Dylan Stewart, and that was a fierce pass rush that they had. Their secondary is, believe it or not, their strength. They have a very, very good secondary as well. And dipping over a little bit into the offensive side of the ball as well, one of the more underrated acquisitions that they got through the transfer portal was Rashul Faison, the running back out of Utah State. I think that was a solid get for them. He could be an explosive guy. And only 4 other transfer portal running backs had better yardage than Faison last year. So I think he could end up being a solid piece for them going forward. South Carolina, that's a team I think could absolutely sneak into the playoffs because building off of a 9-win season, and they've got a lot of positive things, a lot of hype coming out of South Carolina this offseason. So it'll be fun to see them, see what they do going forward. But the last team on my list, I admittedly left them last because I am a Gator fan. So selfishly, I wanted to talk about them last. So the thing that excites me about the Florida Gators this year is DJ Lagway, mainly, because I feel like he is the type of guy that the Gators have been looking for, in terms of athletic ability and all that since Tim Tebow left. I mean, Lagway didn't go crazy in terms of numbers last year, but he was very good at the end of the year. He started and finished 6 games. He did deal with some injuries here and there. He was a freshman last year too, so that's also got to be taken into account. He threw for 9 touchdowns. And the hope really is that with a full offseason as the starter, he will just only get better. And, he was on pace to get about 25 touchdown passes overall last year if he would have started every game. So he, I think, can improve. Of course, his athletic ability is obviously a big asset for that offense. And he won MVP in the Gators bowl game last year. And he also, the thing that I really, really liked is just some of the things he said after the game and how he's just not satisfied. And you could tell the guy is hungry to be better and hungry to succeed at Florida. And that's the kind of player that you want. You want a guy that wants to be there and a guy that wants to win, not just, put his name down so he can have a nice big contract when he gets to the NFL. Obviously that's a perk, and obviously he would want to do that, but I like guys that want to win. That's the great thing about college football is that I feel like there are more guys in college football that really truly want to win than there are in the NFL. Not to say that there's not a lot of guys in the NFL that are like that. It's just college. I feel like it means more to them because they're fighting for their future essentially. Whereas the NFL, they've made it. And of course the next goal in the NFL is winning a Super Bowl. So there's motivation there, of course, from players, but I feel like college football players are a lot hungrier, at this point of their careers. The Gators secondary as well, they're returning 4 starters, so that defense should be improved. That's the one thing that I have said watching the Gators is that their defense really has been the thing that's let them down over the course of the last couple of years, which is unfortunate because their defense is typically very, very good, and it's usually the offense that struggles, but the offense, I think, will be better, and the defense, I think, will be better. Don't think Florida's going to make the playoffs or anything like that. I just think that they could be a much better team than they were last year and build on some of that momentum that they got last year towards the end of the year with DJ Lagway running the show. As long as he can stay healthy, I think the Gators could make some noise overall. So we'll be interested to see how everything goes, but that should just about do it for this show. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know it's a little bit of a long show, but I do appreciate everybody sticking around and watching the show throughout. Thank you once again just for tuning in to the GSMC Football Podcast. Of course, we're always presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support does mean a lot to us, so please remember just to subscribe to the show and leave a positive review. It really does make a difference. So we also do invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, X, and Instagram, and all the other social media outlets for more content and more updates. Thank you once again, and tomorrow keep an eye out for our show as we're going to continue or finish off our mock draft and continue some season outlooks as well. So take a look out for that, and overall, I hope you guys have a wonderful night. Thanks.
Let's go. I wake
wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn it.